Hey guys, Mike Gano with my next Red Chip Poker video for you. Today I'll be helping you take your c-betting game to the next level. As I've said here, there's more to poker than c-betting because you have initiative. So kind of a snarky comment I've made, but I'll admit that I have heard this idea before. I doubt it's going to apply to many of you. Hopefully you've moved past c-betting 100%. So where I imagine some of you are, though, is still in that phase of c-betting dry boards when you're bluffing and checking the wet ones, which is a perfectly good strategy. And it's correct to use versus many players. But today we're going to go past that. For example, if you face stronger opponents, then this becomes less true. Or sometimes the board texture is more ambiguous. It's not quite clear whether it's more wet or more dry. It's a bit of both. Or sometimes you face more than one opponent. Leveling up the C game is something that I want to help you do today. So I think the best way to do that is by going over a bunch of hands. And I have a brave student who has submitted a bunch of c-betting hands to me with some great questions. She is a Red Chip Poker member as well, and she plays in the U.S. On U.S. sites. So since I know a whole bunch of you guys are also based in the U.S., I thought it would also be cool to include some hands that were played on a U.S. site. Actually, I just wrote a blog about the U.S. sites if you're curious, if you want to learn more about them, if you're not familiar with the best U.S. sites. So you can check that out at pokerinabox.com. With that said, let's jump right into these hand examples. Okay, here's the first hand. Hero has ace-jack offsuit in the cutoff. And raises pre-flop. These are, I believe these are all 25-50 cents. So we see the flop and we have one caller from the small blind and we have ace-jack offsuit. So we're in position here. The small blind calls us and we can make a mental note that the small blind has less than a full stack. All that doesn't always mean that it's a recreational player. Your best players are almost always going to have, as long as the site allows you to do so, and I think it does here, to auto top up your stack. So it's at least a read that this isn't, someone that's really serious and plays all the time online. We have ace-jack offsuit, so let's see what our hero does. It's check to us, and we check back. So I'll say awesome job with this. Again, it's important to grow beyond the basics of I raised pre-flop, so I guess that means I should bet the flop. And another thing we can think about here is whether betting a strong ace like this is just going to make a bunch of hands fold that we dominate. Weaker aces or weaker jacks that when we bet a jack 10, while a hand like jack 10 may still call, hands like ace 10, ace 5, ace 3 are all probably going to fold. So there's, and the way this plays out, I'll go ahead, our opponent bets and our hero calls. So this is the key step right here. We're not checking back this flop just to give up. We're checking back because we plan to call our opponent on the turn. Of course, our opponent could have a made hand here and have us beat, but realize that betting the flop is not going to change that fact. If we're beat by a pair on the flop, whether we bet the flop and then check back turn fold river, or we check the flop and call the turn, either way, we're putting it a bet versus those hands that beat us. Makes sense? So by checking back here, we are actually bluff catching against what we think are some weaker opponents, some weaker hands in our opponent's range. Now, if we had a read that our opponent was really tight and really strong here, and really conservative, then those reads could push us to just give up on this turn. But barring all of that, this is a nice play. So river pairs, our opponent checks, and indeed our opponent did have actually a pretty nice draw, but the read that our opponent's a shorter stack, so it could be more recreational, could be on a wider range here in the small blind, held up, seeing something as weak as 10-8 offsuit. Here is hand number 2. Hero is now on the button with King 5 suited, and it's folded to us. The hero makes a raise for over 2 big blinds. We get a call from the small blind and a call from the big blind, and we note the stack sizes, as we always should, that they're both somewhat shorter stacks. So again, we can go with that soft read. I like to qualify my reads. It can be a strong read or a confident read that we know is true, or we can qualify that, be like, well, it's just an inkling, I'm not quite sure that this is true. So with stack size reads, they're somewhere in between. The thing is, if the stack size is right near a full stack, sometimes someone's not using auto top up, but they're just doing it manually. But as you get lower and lower, it becomes more and more likely that this is a recreational player, which in turn implies wider ranges. So we raise this pre-flop, we get this flop, and let's see what happens. Our hero checks back. Now, on this one, I actually like a bet here. And the main reason is because there's so many cards we can barrel on the turn. Usually, it's true we should be cautious about c-betting into 2 players like this. But again, these guys are on very wide ranges for 2 reasons. One is, as I said, they may be more recreational, but 2, they're in the blinds. And we all play more hands in the blinds, in the big blind at least. So given that we've already put some money in. So those 2 facts, that these opponents are probably on wider ranges, which, what does that mean? Let's dig into that for a second. Wider ranges. A wider range means that there's just, if you want to visualize it, just start randomly picking cards in your head. They're going to have a whole bunch of them. So Queen 9, 8, 7, well, that's a gut shot. Ace 7, that's nothing. 10, 4 suited maybe from this big blind. 4, 3 suited. 6, 4, they're sometimes going to hit 2 cards. So they're going to have a distributed range of pairs. Like they're going to hit all of these cards potentially, but you can fit, if you think of all those broadways, just a bunch of random cards that are going to be not connecting with anything. So to summarize that, we see some air, maybe some jacks, but just as far as jacks go, we'll see just as many 6x and probably even 4x. They're going to have a really distributed range. So what that means is, even though we may not get folds all the time from both these guys, when they do call, they're going to have all kinds of stuff. While they may have a jack some of the time, they're also going to have a 6 a lot of the time. They're going to have a 4 a lot of the time. They're going to have some gut shots connected with this a lot of the time. So as long as we're comfortable barreling on the turn with a reasonable frequency, then we can push these guys off what are bound to be relatively weak hands. So that's what I started off by saying. I like a bet here because there's a couple things going on. We have our backdoor flush draw, and I like to recognize when I've got a 3-card straight draw. Now, yeah, a 3-card straight draw is not a very good draw, but it is a good draw in terms of barreling cards. So when we have 4, 5, 6, if there's a 7 or an 8 or a 3 or a 2, then those are all cards, we pick up either an open-ended straight draw or a gut shot, which gives us a little more equity, which lets us bet. So those are all these 3 cards, along with our backdoor flush draw, could be reasons we could bet. We do want to be a little careful with some of those lower cards, because if we think, for example, that they're connected with the jack, the 6, or the 4. If they've got a 6 or a 4, it's probably a connector, right? So if we think about the connectors, they could be 7-6, they could be ace-6, but 7-6, 6-5, 5-4, 4-3, hands like that. So if you imagine, first of all, if a 5 comes, it hits us. But if a 3 comes, they're also making straight draws, right? If they have, or they're hitting the 3. If the 2 comes, it's a safer card for us. If an 8 comes, it's also a safer card for us, because only if they have 7-6, 6-5 with the 8, I mean, they can still be making some straights as well. Also, our 5 blocks some of those, makes it less likely they've got a 5, right? So there's a little bit of play here that we have to consider, that when they do connect with the 6 or the 4, we may not be as comfortable barreling, like a 3 or a 7. An 8 or a 2 is better. Heart is great. And then there's one last thing I'll mention, which is if we bet and they've got a hand like King 10, King 9, King 8, then they're probably going to fold. And we've just cleaned up one of our outs, which is pretty cool. If, say, we get called by the other player. So that's one more thing to think about if you're deciding whether to c-bet bluff the flop, is, are you going to actually get hands that dominate you to fold? If the answer is yes, then awesome. If the answer is no, then reconsider it. And as we saw in the last example, with 2 cards as high and strong as ace-jack, it's not that we're folding hands that dominate us. We're folding hands that we dominate, which is not what we're trying to do. Here's our next hand. Hero has ace-5 of spades in the cutoff. It's folded to us. We raise. We get called by the player in position. And now we see that we're both deep here. We're still 50 and out, and this player, our effective stacks are near 100 big blinds, or 200 big blinds. And the rest of the players fold. So cutoff versus button, a little deeper, and we have ace-5 suited, totally whiff the flop, and we see king, king, 9. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that one of our first learnings that typically happens with poker, is with respect to c-betting, is to c-bet bluff the dry boards. Okay, well, is this board dry? How do we answer that? Let's discuss what makes a dry board. First of all, paired boards, such as this, can be considered more dry, because there's less ways that someone can hit it. Less sets, for example, are possible, less monsters. Rainbow boards are dry. This is not a rainbow board. There's a flush draw possible. High, low, low is a very common texture, like a high card and 2 low cards. Well, this is technically high, high, low, but it's a high card and a medium card. And what that means, it'd be nice if that was an 8. This is somewhat coordinated, because I want you to, if not already, get in the habit of just visualizing all the cards that fit in there between, right? That are making gut shots, the queen jack, the queen 10, the jack 10. So this is somewhat coordinated. And also another thing that makes dry boards is if it's all low, because players tend to have more high cards. So if it's all low, that could also be dry. But there's something missing here from this dry board analysis. What additional information do we need to have in order to truly estimate how dry the board is? I'll give you a second to think about it. You can pause if you don't know the answer. I'm sure a lot of you are shouting it right now. Of course, our opponent's range. We can't fully estimate whether a board is dry without also considering our opponent's range. So take this board as an example. Yes, it's paired, that makes it dry. It's somewhat coordinated, as I said, with the king and the 9. Flush is possible. So it is feeling a bit wet, but it depends on our opponent's range. Whether he, not just whether he has Broadway cards here that are going to fit in there between the king and the 9, because just about everybody does. But the real question is, how much of his whole range do those Broadway cards represent? If he's calling pre-flop with half the deck, as many recreational players do, then it's actually a pretty small percentage, all of these Broadway cards. And in that case, sure, we can treat this as more dry and we can fire away. But if he's tight, if he's nice and tight, and then we think about his range, then the Broadways and pairs will actually represent most of it, right? And in that case, we should give up. So without any additional information here, besides his stack size, I would actually lean towards giving up in this spot because he's called us button versus cutoff. Online calling ranges in positions from regs tend to be pretty tight, especially when there's not a whole bunch of players left to act in a full ring game that are going to play passively and just call and create that waterfall effect to pad your odds pre-flop. That's not happening so much in online six max. The players calling you, if they're regs, are usually pretty tight. So we need to be cautious here, and for that reason, I would be giving up on this board. And again, if we had a read that he was more recreational, then we could bet this. But even his stack size alone is a bit of an indicator. Like if someone's got a big stack, kind of the opposite of the small stack, sure, recreational players run it up, but in a vacuum, he's just a little more likely to be a reg if we see a big stack than not. And our next hand, Hero has the JJ, and I believe Hero here is under the gun. So of course we're going to raise our jacks in a six-handed game, and we get a call from the cutoff. Button folds, small blind folds, big blind folds. Okay, so we see this flop of 7-3-2 double suited with a full stack player that has position on us. I think it's a no-brainer here that we're betting. And ooh, opponent raises. Ugh. So no c-betting discussion would be complete without talking about what we should do when raised. How do we figure this out? Well, the first question is, what do we know about this guy? If he's aggressive, then this becomes a more straightforward call. If he's super passive, maybe we find a fold. If this is a live game, it's easier to find a fold. But for online, I truthfully can't remember the last time I folded an overpair like this in such a spot online. So our hero asked a very good question, and that is, if we're calling when we're always just folding on the turn, is that really a good idea? I like this question a lot. I'm sure many of you have the same question. So the quick answer is no. If you're calling the turn and calling the flop, always folding the turn, and you think he bets all the time, then that just doesn't sound like a good idea. No. But the real question is, or the next question is, how often is he actually doing that? If you're calling the flop, so I just talked about how we want to make our best assessment of whether he's aggressive or not. If we don't know, the default should be to call. And then if we've assessed that we don't think basically, I'll put it like this. If we don't know that he's passive enough to always have it on this flop, then our underlying assumption is that sometimes he doesn't have it, which is a perfectly reasonable assumption. There's a flush draw possible, right? He could have hands like ace 2, ace 3, ace 4, ace 5, suited connectors like 6-5, 5-4. These are all either like a baby pair or a gut shot or a flush draw. These are all potentially in our opponent's range. So if we've assessed on the flop that he doesn't always have it, then on the turn, for him to be betting any two cards is starting to sound kind of spewy. You can simply ask what you would do when if you bluff raise this flop, are you going to bet 100% on the time on the turn? I'm pretty confident the vast majority of you would say no. You're going to give up a fair amount of the time on the turn, which is the right thing to do. It's what your trusty GTO solver would tell you to do. So the answer is really another question. How often do we really think our opponent is going to do that? And most opponents are not doing it all the time. If what's really driving that underlying fear is that you picture this guy in your head hammering on the turn every single time, then really we need to come back to the flop and say, well, is really what you're afraid of is the fact that this guy has it the vast majority of the time, in which case that's why you think he's going to be betting with such a high frequency, because you just think he always has it. And I encourage you to just reflect on that. You could pull up your range tool and put in your opponent's calling range pre-flop and see whether your best guess, if you don't have any information about him, then think about what you've seen other players do, think about what you do, and put a range down there for him calling you pre-flop. And be honest about how much of that range is going to include all the hands I talked about, like the low suited aces, low suited connectors. In my game, there's lots of players either calling or 3-betting with those hands and not folding them. So think about whether you can put all those hands in our opponent's range. It's hard to hit a set. So if all this guy is repping is if you think that this guy only has 3 sets, well, then he better be a pretty passive opponent to be making a play like that, because it's just unlikely based on most people's calling range. All that said, as played, we call a raise, as we should, and our opponent bets again, giving it away, spoiler, when the ace of spades falls, and our hero folds. And I think that's perfectly reasonable. If we go back to the range I described, we have flush draws that got there. We have some ace 2 through ace 5 that got there. Only thing that's not really getting there is even, I'm just noticing it now, even 5-4 got there. So this is a tough card because of the only thing that I'm giving him that didn't get there is like 6-5. I don't think players are calling with 6-4. So bad card for us on the turn. It is a little interesting that it's the ace of spades, because it cuts out it does reduce the number of combos of flushes, because ace of spades X is a good chunk of his calling hands that are flush draws. But there's still plenty of other stuff, as I just mentioned, that improves for this guy. So it's a good fold on hero's part. Okay, here's our next hand. I've got a couple more for you. Hero raises. The button calls and the big blind calls. And making a note of their stack sizes, it looks like we're now at 25 in L. So these players have full stacks. Let's check to us, and with our overpair, hopefully this is a no-brainer for you guys. Easy value bet. We get called by both players. So that, of course, can be a little worrisome. But let's think a little deeper. Let's think about what this means. Well, would you say this board is coordinated? I think we can say absolutely yes. So I would imagine if these players are sitting there with a strong hand like a set, which would be the most likely strong hands, like 7-5, maybe from the big blind, but probably not from the button. Hands like 6-3, again, a little less likely. Even 6-4, probably not from the button. So most likely hands on the flop, strong hands, are sets. If the player's sitting there with a hand that strong, they're probably going to raise us. I would, because I'd be nervous to allow any more cards to come on this board. So it's safe to say that either of these opponents will probably be raising if they've got something as strong as a set. So what else could they have? Well, they could have flush draws, they could have straight draws, they could have a 6, a 4, or a 3 in terms of hands like 6-5, 5-4, ace 6, ace 4, hands like that. So when the 4 comes on the turn, yes, it's possible they could have hit a 4, but there's so many other hands they can have. And 2 4s, one way to think about this means that that's one less 4 for them to have. So it's more likely, if we're going to give them something like ace 4, it's more likely they have like ace 6 or ace 3 or ace 5, right? Those are more likely than the 4 because there's 2 4s here now. So not only are there a lot of other hands, many of the similar hands are more likely, so we shouldn't really be too concerned. And what I'm leading up to is our hero checks. This is another way to sort of summarize that is whenever a low card pairs and you are the one with initiative, you're the one that bet, it's usually a good thing for you when one of the middle or the bottom card pairs. So this is a pretty good thing for us. There's still other hands like 8s and 7s and 9s that our opponent could have, pocket 5s. A hand like jacks is possible, but our opponent probably could be raising some of the time. And then, of course, queens, kings, and aces. It's getting very likely that our opponent would re-raise this pre-flop. So bottom line, it looks really good, and I think our hero could get some more value by betting this turn. As played, it checks through. And again, the 9 is a pretty harmless card unless we're specifically giving them pocket 9s. And I don't want you guys to be too afraid of, the nuts out there or the monsters out there, because the important thing to realize is there's so many other cards. Don't overweight those scary hands in your head. So we check. Our opponent does get in one more good c-bet on the river. I think more than half pot would be good. At this point, our opponent is probably, I go up to 60, 70% to get calls from like 8s, 7s, and ace 6. We check the turn, so our opponent isn't going to expect us to actually have hands like aces, kings, queens, jacks, even 10s. If I was playing someone, I wouldn't actually put them on 10s now because I'd expect them to bet it on the turn. So our hand is a bit disguised in strength, which means we'll get looked up a little lighter on the river, or in other words, they'll be willing to call bigger bets. And here we go with the last one. So we've got queen 9 suited under the gun. I guess we're next act. Middle position. We raise queen 9 of clubs, get called by the button. Yeah, this replayer is a bit odd the way it's like putting the button out here in no man's land. So what's happening here is we get called by the button and we get called by the small blind. And we are based, it looks like we're back to 50 NL. Just double checking that. And we have queen 9. We have a gut shot and a backdoor flush draw. And this, I'm finishing with this one because this one's actually, I think this one's quite interesting. They've all been interesting, but this one's challenging, shall we say. Is this board, we have a bluff, right? We don't have a made hand. So the question is, is this dry enough to bet? And it's paired like before. But this is quite coordinated, right? With a 10 and the 8 and the diamonds. We've got 2 players, which should make us less inclined to c-bet bluff. A coordinated board, even though it's paired. But we got a gut shot. We got a pretty good hand. So this is a tough one, right? We've just got mixed signals for all of our typical indicators that help us, decide which way to go. So that said, I'm okay either way. I think checking it could be okay, betting could be okay. I would probably lean towards a bet based on our position. If we were out of position and the 2 players they call us both had position on us, then I'd probably check. If I had position on both players, like I raise on the button and the blinds call, then I think it's a much easier bet. But in the middle here, we do have position on one player. So in a very rudimentary perspective, you know, there's kind of a 50% chance that we'll be in position after we bet. And if I can get position after I place this bet on the flop, then I'm a happy man. I'm confident that I can realize equity with this hand. So given I got a 50-50 shot at that, yeah, I'd go ahead and make the bet. It's gonna, if we check and this player bets, and that's the spoiler, she does decide to check. The player bets. Now we've got an overcard, a gut shot, and a backdoor flush draw. So we don't want to fold. That should be very clear. We're not checking to fold. We're checking to call. And now we're out of position and going to the turn. So it's an uncomfortable place to be. It is possible to, it is certainly possible to show a profit here. And in fact, it's often the right play, even heads up, to be check calling with some hands like this, with some gut shots some of the time. So if you are really uncomfortable playing out of position, you know, I don't blame you for betting here, but from a long-term perspective, you need to get comfortable. Like, there are going to be lots and lots of spots where you should, it's your best play, if you were to play well in and out of position, would be to check call. So again, I think your two options are close. I do lean more towards a bet, but check calling is okay too. We check call and check to our opponent, and we still just have a gut shot. Our opponent bets and we fold, and I think that's perfectly reasonable. This king is a tough card. I think because our opponent, you know, can bet this as a scare card. When we check call, we clearly don't have a 10 or better. We're betting a 10 or better. We don't have an 8. So what we're saying is we have a draw, or we've got you know, maybe a pair or less than an 8, and that's why we're checking. So we're kind of inviting our opponent to bluff us. And at the same time, when our opponent bets the flop, our opponent can still have more king X than we do, potentially. So it's I think it's okay to fold here on the turn, since we've only got a 4-outer now, potentially. But as our hero adeptly pointed out, if we had bet the flop, then, you know, we are the ones that still have kings in our range and get to represent the king, and we are the ones that get to use the fold equity to get our opponent to fold. So it's a tough one, but interesting nonetheless. That will wrap the video. Thank you guys so much for watching. This is, as usual, this is all my contact information. I welcome you to get in touch if you so desire. Post questions on Red Chip Poker, always willing to talk about them. And my YouTube address, I'll point that out, is on there as well under my name. This has been Mike Gano doing another video for Red Chip Poker. Take care, guys.